Thank you very, very much for all your work during the last week. Thank you to the tutors, the teachers for transmitting such a great knowledge and given sense to Utopia, our European alliance. I'm quite impressed by the work that you all did, and I'm keen to hear you now. Of course, everything that you say will be good. Lydia, we discussed yesterday with Lydia, we proposed this, framework. It's not a framework of evaluation, but it's just to understand what is expected from this kind of exercise. And for you, maybe it's easier for in the future to better better do the work. Anyway, everything that you did is valuable for Utopia. And as I said, that was in July when we last meet together. Your input into the governance charter will be part of our future governance charter. Everything that students and teachers did this week is very, very important for us. And we hope that by the end of this academic year, we have the governance charter, and everything that you worked during these last days will be part of it. And of course, I will not take back the microphone at the end. Lydia, you will end the sessions with the professors. But if needed, and I'm sure that there is this need during all the academic year, you can be part of this work on the governance charter of Utopia. So don't hesitate to contact colleagues in your universities that would like to join. It is still possible to join. There will be other small chapters of the governance charter to be worked with. And of course, your names will be written in this final document, which will be maybe the constitution of Utopia. So thank you very much. And I'm all yours now.
So dear professors, dear colleagues, thank you very much for your participation as well as your constant support during the last week workshop. That is very enlightening for us to comprehend different principles in university governance. So today, as the first group, we are going to talk about the two governance principles, which are scientific diplomacy, as well as the inclusion as a principles in university governance. So I will briefly introduce to you the structure of our presentation today. So first of all, we are going to give you a short presentation of our team composition, and then we are going to situate you in the context, so which is the Utopia in our case, European University Initiative. And then we are going to explore deeper the two concepts, which are scientific diplomacy and peace and inclusion, especially with the relevance of why we consider them as a must to be included in the university governance charter. And finally, we're going to connect the concepts and to propose relevant issue accordingly to the Utopia's governance charter. So first of all, for the team composition, we are three preparing this presentation for our oral defense. We have Ana Puigderrajols. I'm really sorry for my weird Spanish. So she is a graduate in political science at UPF, and now she is studying law. And my name is Zhengwen Qi, and I'm a PhD researcher at VUB, and my research involves leadership's role in the internationalization of higher education institutions. And we have also Carmen Mazijn, who is the team leader, and she is also a PhD researcher at VUB, and she works now on the ethics of AI. And let me give you a brief introduction of the context. So as you all know, the Utopia as European University is part of the global scene of education, research, and innovation, and influenced by various local and international processes. Launched after the first European Commissions, the originally 6, now 9 partner universities committed all together to bring change to higher education and research in Europe. And for the background information for our two topics, the European Commission announced to review its international R&D collaboration policy to open to the world. And global actors such as the UN and the G7 call for inclusive and open societies, including for solidarity and open science. So all of those background information gives us the impetus to dig more the two concepts that we are going to present to you briefly, which are scientific diplomacy and inclusion as principles in university governance. So without further ado, I will give this floor to Carmen to give you more information on the scientific diplomacy.
Thank you. Okay, so our first topic is scientific diplomacy, and we'll start off, of course, with a little definition. The term itself, scientific diplomacy, was coined by the US government approximately a decade ago, and it is therefore a rather new term, although different practices had been in place before. Since then, there has been some evolution in the definition of the term. And just a small note, science in science diplomacy includes all research practices, also the arts and the humanities, not only the empirical disciplines. But science diplomacy is actually an umbrella term of practices and principles mobilizing scientists and diplomats. In 2009, the following taxonomy for science diplomacy was formed by the American Association of the Advancement of Science. And there were at that point 3 elements. Science in diplomacy, where scientific know-how and evidence is used to inform and support the foreign policy objectives. Secondly, diplomacy for science, where the diplomats had a big role, and their efforts and resources were aimed at facilitating international scientific cooperation. And then thirdly, science for diplomacy, where scientific cooperation is used as a source of soft power to strengthen and foster foreign relations. However, a 4th dimension of science diplomacy has recently been added, and that is called diplomacy in science, where the use of diplomatic skills and tools are used in advocating for global scientific knowledge, understanding of the scientific process, the translation of science into societal impacts. We also have a slide where a very nice visual that we wanted to show you to maybe give you a bit more of insight in these different terms. This slide only includes the 3 terms that I've mentioned before. So you can see that science in diplomacy, you have the scientists who use their scientific advice to inform the policy, the international diplomacy. Secondly, diplomacy for science, where you have the diplomats, the international diplomacy processes facilitating science cooperation. And then thirdly, science cooperation, then improving again this international diplomacy as a soft power. Don't worry if you don't get, if you won't remember the 3 and even the 4 different elements. It is just to show that there's several ways of looking at science diplomacy. But we will now try to argue why we believe that scientific diplomacy is a must-have in the EUTOPIA governance principles, not a nice-to-have. And we'll do that from the different perspectives. So students, universities, nations, the EU, and then of course, EUTOPIA. So students are very important. As universities, we have the responsibility to prepare our students as global citizens. And therefore, through curricular or extracurricular educational activities, they can acquire skills to prepare them for the global challenges requiring multidisciplinary collaboration. These activities also include internships with groups that work at the intersection of science and policy. And through these experiences, they will build a network which will be useful in their future careers, but where they will also increase their capacity to leverage their scientific expertise and backgrounds in either policy or diplomacy. And secondly, for universities, there are several developments in higher education, in research institutions, such as the massification and expansion of higher education, the differentiation, and also the internationalization. The internationalization evolves on several levels, including scientific objectives, but also interaction between scholars and the interaction between scientific organizations. So advocating for scientific diplomacy is inherent with the prospective development of universities. However, without career incentives and institutional backing, the majority of scientists will probably not engage in a systematic way with scientific diplomacy. So in order to mobilize our communities, we need support from the universities. Thirdly, the nations. Nations are still a core stakeholder in diplomacy processes, and therefore we also want to give a couple of examples of how they engage with the concept of science diplomacy. Also because Utopia has members in several countries, so there's several nations engaging in stakeholders in our world. Okay, so for example, countries such as Canada, Germany, and Switzerland, they use diplomacy for science to attract highly skilled people and strengthen their diplomatic ties. The United States already has a very high influx of international researchers, but they regard scientific cooperation as a means of bringing opposing sides closer together, really bridge building, bringing sides together. And then thirdly, also a very interesting example, Japan uses science and technology really as a resource, a diplomatic resource, to increase its soft power. And then we come to the European Union. They are very explicit in certain documents and maybe a bit less explicit in other documents, but the science diplomacy really is on the table, is on the agenda. They use scientific exchanges to really raise awareness among scientific community in third countries on EU values, visions, priorities. They also use it to strengthen the excellence and attractiveness of our research in the continent, or as an instrument of soft power, as we've seen that also Japan engages with. And then, yeah, peace and development are really used as an end goal of science diplomacy. So yes, the EU really works with the concept. And then for Utopia, as was mentioned in the previous slides, there are several processes going on the level of education, research. We know that through the Erasmus programs, education, which is normally quite national competence, has gotten an international component, but also research is historically a very international occupation. More recently, then there also has been a transfer for innovation system from a national to an international level. Therefore, it is essential to take up our role as a stakeholder. We should not be naive. We are a stakeholder in these processes. And if we want to create the future of European universities, we have to get active in that. These actions will, of course, and also lead to better science, better education, and including better opportunities for our scientists and students. And additionally, they promote the scientific methods as in diplomacy for science. Based on these arguments, we argue that scientific diplomacy is a key principle or is a concept that should be ingrained in our governance principles. And we have come up with 3 principles that we want to share with you. We have building capacity, we have developing trust, and we also have supporting collaboration. So first of all, Utopia acknowledges and builds capacity of all its members as scientific diplomacy actors. All our researchers, staff, and students should become trained translators and provided with the necessary skills to interact with communities beyond which you would normally, on a normal day, meet with, to increase global knowledge and advance humanity. Secondly, we've seen in the past year and a half that at some points there is a lack of trust between scientists and the global community, or even between scientists and policy makers. And that's why Utopia should take up a role and commit to developing trust, which will produce mutual recognition and credibility between different stakeholders, which will also contribute to the legitimacy of the processes and involved individuals. And then thirdly, Utopia embraces open knowledge creation and supports collaboration. And this maybe sounds as a very obvious principle, but we still think that this is really at the core of Utopia. So we wanted to add it in here. And it also has a very clear link with scientific diplomacy. by being this open on a level of research and education, we invite the global community of researchers and students to work together. And while doing that, we also promote the fundamental values of the European Union, including human dignity, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. So these were the three governance principles based on scientific diplomacy. I'll now give the words to Anna to talk about our second topic.
Thank you, Carmen. So our second topic makes reference to the individual as the core of an inclusive and humanist alliance. But before proceeding to argue the importance of including this as a governance principle, we will proceed to the definition of the concept of inclusion. First of all, we can find in Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in Article 2 of the Treaty of Lisbon, the definition of inclusion understood as the lack of discrimination because of certain factors such as race, color, sex, language. Here we wanted to point out that inclusion is not about only not being discriminating because of those factors, but we also have to talk about economical inclusion, social inclusion, digital inclusion, environmental inclusion, especially nowadays in our societies. Adopting a more academical approach, we can talk about three inclusion paradigms for education. First of all, the first paradigm makes reference to the culture of peace. This concept argues that there's a need to solve the disputes between people, between organizations, through dialogue and negotiation. And the final goal is to avoid war like happened in the past in the last century. The second paradigm makes reference to the culture of inclusion, and this concept makes reference to the need that all the social identity groups can participate in an equal way in the collective activities. But if we adopt a more organizational perspective, if we apply the concept of culture of inclusion in an organizational perspective, we see how there's a need to include the diversity within the organization in the formulation of strategies, in the formulation of programs, which means that at the end we need to have programs which have a multicultural vision, which have a multicultural approach. And the third paradigm makes reference to the culture of human security business partnerships. And this can be explained as the need that the individuals feel secure in the spaces where they operate in their daily lives. For example, the individuals need to feel safe, and the way to achieve that, according to this paradigm, is to developing preventive action in order to avoid discrimination situations to happen, and also give effective tools to the individuals in order to face the discrimination situations once they have already happened. We have defined three main factors to consider when building an inclusive alliance. The first factor makes reference to the relationship between universities as co-actors of the alliance. If we want to build an inclusive alliance, the universities, apart from competing with each other, they need to give mutual support. Because if we want the European Union to be competitive in the global level, no university can be left behind. And related to that, we thought it's important that there's a shared access to knowledge between universities, and this is connected with the need to have digital services that allow that. The second factor that we consider to be relevant is access. And here there are two dimensions. First of all, access to university. Students must be able to access university without any kind of discrimination, but, and this is linked with the second dimension, once they are inside universities, they also need to have equal access to the different activities that are organized. They need to have the chance to participate in all the activities. And apart from that, when we talk about access inside universities, infrastructures have a key role. Infrastructures can play a role in inclusion, and we have to make sure that all the students with all the special needs can feel comfortable in our universities, and if we have the infrastructures that are needed for this, inclusion will be reached more easily. Not to mention digital resources as well, and to make sure that all students, at least in the context of university, have access to the digital resources that they need to proceed with their studies. And finally, related what it has said before, when building an inclusive alliance, we have to consider the student diversity, because universities are not isolated from the social reality, and they have to reflect the diversity that the society has and have to reflect the diversity within the students that are part of the university. This means that all the sensibilities have to be taken into consideration when defining activities, when defining programs, and also there's the need to create participation spaces and processes in which students feel comfortable to share their opinions and their views. So at this point, we will talk about why is it important for Utopia to include inclusion as a governance principle. As we said, the context matters, and Utopia is developed in the frame and under the frame of the European Union. And the European Union is a reference in the protection and promotion of human rights. So Utopia, as part of this European Union, needs to be fully committed with inclusion and all the human rights that the European Union embraces. On the second point, Utopia as a university alliance is not, as we were saying before, is not isolated of the social reality, and it has to walk parallelly with the society and the social changes. So that's why taking steps to build an inclusive alliance is so important. And finally, building an inclusive alliance can contribute in maintaining a European society aligned with European values and human rights. To sum up, Utopia can be a framework to work towards inclusion by defining principles, by adopting measures, but also can be a forum in which the different stakeholders, say to be students, universities, etc., can share their best practices, because the fight for inclusion is not a new fight, and universities have already taken steps, so it can be a framework to take steps even to get closer to get even closer to inclusion, but also to share what has been already done and to learn from each other. And we've been hearing during these days that Utopia is a student-centered alliance, but this statement is not only a theoretical statement, but it needs to have practical implications, and we have identified 4 implications that can be described due to this statement. First of all students must have the opportunity to access university in equal terms and to participate to university in equal terms as well once they have already accessed it. Students must feel comfortable and must feel safe at the university without any fear to be discriminated, and they need to feel that in the case they have efficient tools to face these situations. And finally, all the students need to be able to develop their intellectual and social potential, and we consider that this is only possible through inclusion, because if there is no exchange of opinions, if there's no critical thinking, and you learn from each other and learn how to listen to other perspective and to be tolerant and learn to solve the disputes in a peaceful way, you won't be able to develop all the potential, because you will miss a lot of information that otherwise you would get. And according to all that has been said, we've identified and we've defined 3 main principles that we consider relevant to be included in the charter. So the first principle makes reference to the need to build an inclusive and multicultural alliance, but making it through the development of an inclusive university governance, because it's very interrelated. And how do we propose to concrete this? First of all, we think that to have an inclusive university governance, there needs to be, and the decision-making procedures must be defined in an inclusive way. Of course, we need as well to create spaces where all the students can be represented, and ensure that the students and the universities have the efficient tools in order to face discrimination situations. But with this principle, we also want to emphasize the fact that we are building a European university from the very beginning, so we have the chance to build an ethical university, an inclusive university from the very beginning, but which is also competitive with the rest of the universities in the world, but in an ethical way and in a fair way, and ensuring that everybody can access it. Our second principle makes reference to build an inclusive culture, but within the university bodies, once they have been already configured. So in this sense, we say, and this is related to the culture of inclusion, we say that the alliance need to include all the perspective and sensibilities when defining strategies, but not only on the strategies at the top, but also in the management and the operating systems in order to become a referent of the protection and promotion of human rights. And the last principle, maybe it can be a bit obvious, but students play a core role in the alliance because universities without students lose a lot of sense. So we wanted to recognize the role that students have in universities. And with this principle, we want to emphasize the need that students have equal opportunities to access universities, and they have the equal opportunities once they have access to the university. And in this way, they can feel safe and they can develop their European Union conscience and align with European Union values and human rights.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Anna and Carmen, for your for your presentation for the two principles that we have concluded. And just at the end of this presentation, I would like to give some more thoughts by connecting the concepts. So the concepts which were covered during the whole program, actually we consider them to be, they can be linked. So it is therefore important for us to see the governance charter as a whole, but not as separate principles. For example, when we talk about political control over science within the science diplomacy, we have also this concern for institutional autonomy. And also when we talk about distrust of science, this is also related to the peace and inclusion building. And we talk about access to knowledge to foster inclusion. It is also something that is touching on open science. So this is what we want to address, is that like all the principles that we presented during the last week workshop and for today's oral defense, they are actually linked with each other, and we should consider the university charter from the whole, not as separate principles. And just as an initiative from our side, we try to put the linked ideas of the two principles that we just presented as such. Scientific diplomatic activities should reflect the awareness of different degrees of inclusiveness, as well as the fact that inclusion is a political strategic choice. Where useful, one should involve a broadly representative portion of the relevant scientific, political, and diplomatic concerns. And we do hope with the presentation of the second group, we can have a broader view, and maybe by combining both of them, we can contribute to a better university charter for the Utopia project. And that's the end of our project, of our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Start the second presentation from our second group, Jokob, Joseph, Sahil, and Iris. Yes?
Yes. Maybe I'll do the team introduction. And before I do that, I just want to thank everyone. And I want to thank the Utopia Alliance as well to do something like this, where you call upon students, give them a workshop for a week, and then hear their views on very important governance principles and topics. And I also want to thank the professors who did really great job. I really enjoyed all the sessions, and I really do regret missing on a couple of sessions. And I think, I personally think Team 1 did a really good job. Everything was really enlightening, I would say. And there are many things which actually I at least was supposed to say in my part, second on. But as Zhengwen was mentioning, all these principles are kind of related to each other. You cannot properly distinguish between these principles. So maybe we can add upon on that and see how all these principles are interlinked. So for our team, we have two mentors, Karl, who is a PhD student at the University of Gothenburg in environmental epidemiology, if I'm not wrong. And we have Iris from the University of Ljubljana. We have Jokob, who is a PhD student in educational studies and a philosophy student from the University of Ljubljana. And we have Joseph, who is a political sciences graduate and a law student at UPF Barcelona. And then there is me. I'm Sahil. I'm a EUTOPIA co-tutel PhD student between CY Cergy Paris University and the University of Warwick. So we are these 5 people in the team. And now Jokob would start by giving a brief introduction and defining the principles that we are going to talk about today. And then the team members will hop in to elaborate further on the principles.
Thank you, Sahil, for giving me the word. I will just kind of join the chorus of really congratulating the first team. You really did a great job. For our team, the coordination of schedules was unfortunately quite a difficulty for us. So our presentation will be sadly quite limited, but still nonetheless, we did, prepare some preliminary ideas that we do think are worth considering and worth sharing. The way it will go is that we had basically 2 principles. We had the principle of autonomy and academic freedom, and then the second is about the cooperation between alliance partners, about the governance principles behind EUTOPIA Alliance. And I will shortly, as Sahil already said, present first our thoughts on autonomy and academic freedom, and then I will just sort of lay the groundwork for the cooperation between alliances part, and then first Josep, and then after him Sahil will take over with some of our ideas about it. So to begin, the discussion about autonomy and academic freedom always has to start just with a reminder of what we're actually talking about. So when we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about the right of the institutions to kind of define and implement their mission, but most importantly to do this independently of the external factors, which is always the tricky part, how to establish this dynamic. On the other hand, academic freedom is defined as a right of an individual, which is usually nowadays ensured by the autonomy of the institution, but it is a right of the individual either as a staff member, so as a professor, or as a student to have an intellectual debate without fear of censorship or retaliation. And there's always limitations to this freedom also. But what I kind of wanted to point it out is that the way I saw it is that there are 2 elements to these discussions about autonomy and academic freedom. The first element is kind of this relationship dynamic. So the relational dynamic between either the state and the institution in case of the autonomy, or the institution and the individual in case of academic freedom. And this dynamic is always negotiating still. So it's never fixed. There's never said that we have autonomy. There's always said that we have academic freedom. Is always something that kind of needs to be, you could say, through political struggle if you wanted to be a good Marxist, but let's not be that case, but it always has to be negotiated. So it's always in a flux of becoming and being established. On the other element that is also very important is that when we talk about autonomy and academic freedom, we are usually making a normative claim that this is something of value, that it is a value of having autonomy, and that there is a value in having academic freedom. But what exactly this value is something that has changed significantly through history. And that kind of brings us to the old idea of autonomy, which was kind of born in the era of Enlightenment, which, was this really nice old ideal that I think is worth kind of going back to so that we don't forget all the time, that, there is value in itself of just having autonomy. There was even, when Humboldt was writing, there was this idea that, university, there was a little bit of instrumentality also, that in university produces valuable citizens for the state. But there was also this really strong humanistic side of the ideal that there is something in value as of itself that doesn't need to be conditioned of just having autonomy and just having academic freedom as a universal value. And this kind of from the 80s on was kind of starting to change. New discourses were being added. First, a really strong instrumental discourse, basically saying that, in order to have autonomy, it has to be kind of earned either by universities being profitable or at least by giving students who are educable, who are profitable on the educational market, but then also just having this administrative discourse, which is, really useful in trying to define, but it only defines autonomy as, autonomy as having free decisions of universities on their organization, on their financial structures, on their staffing, and on their academic issues. But it doesn't really discuss the values and why we want that, why we need that. And this is basically what I wanted to point out in my thoughts about the principles that Utopia should have when it is thinking about the role of autonomy and academic freedom in its alliance. We can go, Professor Gaga very well said that the devil is always in the details, and I'm going to be smart and avoid the details. Because, we could discuss what are the problems with, for example, how do we ensure autonomy in Utopia for the budgeting structures or the financial issues? Or how do we ensure that there is autonomy in the faculties to decide the curriculum for their own, when we know we have to have really structured, the more complexity we add to the system, the more problematic it gets, how that is. But I wanted to kind of take a step back and just do like 3 very broad points that are a lot of times perhaps missed or not pointed out well enough. And the first one is basically what I already said. So the understanding of autonomy and academic freedom should not be inside of Utopia only understood in administrative or not only in instrumentative terms, but it should have this humanistic perspective also, which is what it was mentioned a lot of times last week. So it's not just about preparing students for the labor market, it's about what I think in Council of Europe definition of autonomy is very well pointed out, that we need to have this idea of university being autonomous to develop the full potential to kind of have the full purpose of higher education embodied in it. So we need, yes, the labor market idea, but we need also to prepare them for the life, to prepare the students for life as active citizens. We need the personal development of students. We need broad advances in the knowledge base, and all of those things should be accounted for when we're thinking about why we need autonomy. The second thing I wanted to point out is connected to what Professor Gaga said already, which is that autonomy and academic freedom is not enough to be just ensured in documents. It's not enough to just be ensured as a legal right. It needs to be lived. So it needs to be a living part of the culture of the alliance. And this is much easier said in theory than actually implemented in reality. Because one of the things that happens, I think, with an autonomy is that it kind of clashes with a very real part of human nature, which is that we don't necessarily enjoy plurality of different ideas and different positions and different theories. So what for me that connects with is that in order to have autonomy and academic freedom, we also need very strongly stress, which Utopia right now does, that having a plurality, or as I think Rancière, the French philosopher, says, not consensus, but dissensus of positions is something of value on itself, so that we value plurality for what it does. It enables us to understand better the diversity of human positions and the diversity of ways of thinking, which is what you already touched on in the previous conversation about the inclusion and not implementing different cultures. And the third last part, the third idea that I wanted to point out is that autonomy should not be only thought of as a right, but also as a responsibility. in a sense where this is the modern enlarged idea of autonomy, which is basically that university is not enclosed anymore. It is at the heart of society. And it should really take to its heart the idea that it should care for having beneficial impact on the environment, and it should have this in the broadest sense of the word. That means that it should take care of, and I know Utopia does that a lot. So in the principles, it has place-based, it has inclusive, which are all basically connected to that, but it should be kept in mind that it's not, autonomy doesn't mean being closed off from the world. It means having the place and the freedom to think, but then having this freedom in order to give something back to the society. And this should be taken not only as a right, but also as a responsibility from university. And with that, I will kind of come to the end of our, to the first part on the autonomy, and go to the second part of our presentation, which will deal with kind of principles for cooperation between different partners. Here, I think the starting point is what has already happened with Utopia till this point. So we know that Utopia was kind of created as a pilot project in order to create universities of the future, which would have European values and European identities. And it would be a new and revolutionary way, to have new quality and new competitiveness for European universities. It started, and right now it is still a project-based alliance, but as we know, it has already been decided that it will try to move to a legal framework in a way, a legal framework which will be, I think, as a confederation, yes, between sovereign universities. I think 9 of them, and this of course opens the question of how should this new legal entity, which has a lot of problems, be governed, how it should be managed, and how it should be led. And we kind of decided to point to broad points about that, let's say, to point them out. So the first one will be what Joseph will talk about, which is the dilemmas about having centralized or decentralized management, and also using the academic and managerial staff in the management of the new alliance. And then Sahil will kind of share his views and understanding of the role that students should have in the new system. So with that said, I will give my word on to Josep to give us his presentation on centralization and decentralization dilemma in the new alliance. Joseph, you have the word.
Yeah, thank you, Jakob. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna talk about the dilemma between centralization and decentralization, and which is clearly connected with the idea of institutional autonomy, but not in its inherent human native value that Jakob has mentioned, but more in its instrumental value, which I'm gonna explain now. And first, I wanna locate this in the context of European integration. In general, in European integration, there has always been the dilemma between more integration, which can be in detriment of national cultures or national institutions, or less integration, but then less capability to cope with global challenges and to make European values advanced in the context of the European integration. That dilemma, we can find it in the integration of the economy, the markets, the political institutions, taxation, and also in the integration of academic institutions, which is what Utopia is about and which is what we are talking about now. So this is the context where we have to locate this discussion. However, we're not exactly in the same terms as the discussion to European integration, because we're not only talking about different cultures, different member state national cultures, we're also talking about different and specific academic traditions of not its member state, but its university. Each specific university has its own academic tradition, and that we think is something that should be valued and preserved. It should be valued and preserved because that, in an instrumental sense, it leads to a better academy from a worldwide perspective, because it leads to specialization. For example, an example to illustrate this is, for example, the Academy in Political Sciences, which is my field of studies. There's universities, there's faculties of political sciences that do focus on quantitative methods, and they have a more specialized and deep knowledge in the use of quantitative methods, while others focus on qualitative methods, and that leads to a deeper knowledge and a more specialized knowledge in each of those methods. So the academy, from a worldwide perspective, benefits of a specialization because each university can make its own specialized specific contribution to the worldwide academy. That is linked to what Professor Zaga said before, that this is the starting point is understanding that there is not a single way of understanding things, of studying things. There is not a single valid theory that we have to find out. There are different valid theories, different valid approaches, and they are all valid. And so we have to create an academy that gives the space to universities to develop their own traditions, to focus on their own fields, on their own methodologies, etc. And when discussing or when focusing this discussion between centralization and decentralization, we wanted to make this point that an excessive centralization might be or risks to be detrimental in terms of preserving these specific academic traditions of each university. So, for example, a policy of merging all programs and merging all curriculums that, for example, might risk that. And that is why we, that is why we prefer talking about cooperation rather than centralization. So the idea that each university cooperates with the other universities in the alliance from their own academic tradition and contributing with their own specialized knowledge as universities of the alliance. And this is linked with the idea that in the building of this European community, in the process of European integration, we're not still in the point of having a European community. And so that is why it is more difficult to have a unique academic community. And until this European community advances and this European integration advances to this European community, it will be difficult to have a single European academic community. But it is also true that an academic integration like the one proposed by EUTOPIA can also be a trigger, can also be an element that reinforces the political integration in the European Union, linked with the idea of scientific diplomacy that has been commented in the previous presentation. So to conclude, between centralization and decentralization, a balance should be struck so that there is the sufficient centralization and the sufficient creation of common bodies to make the values of the alliance advance, but the sufficient decentralization to preserve the academic autonomy and its instrumental value of that each university contributes with its own specialized knowledge to the worldwide academy. And with that, I give the word to Sahil, who's gonna talk about student participation.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna slow down the pace a little bit because this has been a lot of thoughts and comments to take in. So I'll talk about student participation, and I think I'll take academic autonomy and cooperation between alliances as the two principles. However, as I mentioned earlier as well, all the principles that were discussed earlier, which I'll discuss, are really very interlinked. And what I'm going to talk about is how student participation in the future utopia, or in the confederation of utopia, as I would say, when it becomes legal entity, how that should improve, or how student participation can be improved. So talking about academic autonomy and cooperation between alliances is a really complicated topic to address, because at one time you are respecting the autonomy of the universities, and then you're also talking about the cooperation between alliances. So I will focus on how do we promote student participation while maintaining the autonomy and the cooperation between alliances. So before I talk about concrete principles, or I propose some ideas, I would say give a little bit of background of how student associations or what student initiatives are already there in the Utopia Alliance. So according to me, student associations are supposed to be the voice of students to address any issues without any fears, which is like coherent with the idea of being autonomous academically. And when it if we talk about the Utopia Alliance, and when it comes to being student-centric, Utopia, I personally believe, has provided support to the students till now, and it is just a matter of time for those efforts to be recognized and for Utopia to become a true student-centric alliance. So a little bit of background on how the student involvement in Utopia works as of now. So the student associations of different universities have a role which is to encourage the students' voices to be heard on all matters related to the university experience. There is a student council, which is supposed to have one student representative from each partner university of the Alliance, and it is supposed to meet regularly. However, the problem right now with the existing structure of this Utopia Student Council is that the student representatives are already involved in their local student bodies, and it is very difficult for all the student representatives to find to schedule a meeting and to discuss the ideas together. This is just a little drawback that I would like to point out before we go on to discuss other things. The need here is to have some sort of incentivization for students to be more involved in Utopia and to be more involved in student activities. And one such incentivization, if I'm not wrong, was recently started, the ECTS credits thing, which the students will get credits for getting involved in Utopia activities. So these sort of incentivization programs need to be included in the Utopia structure to promote student involvement and to promote student participation in events. And right now, the students tend to keep their interests aligned towards their partner university, mostly towards their partner university. And to get more students involved, what I believe, or what we as a team believe, is to create a common utopian student identity, which would define what an utopian student looks like. 6 universities coming together to create an alliance of shared values and identity should be backed up by creating an identity of an utopian student to build the alliance of students for better cooperation and teamwork. And as Luciana was mentioning, this becomes more important. Creation of this utopian student identity becomes more important due to Brexit, which might lead some people to think that UK students are less European. Personally, I believe a referendum doesn't change how people view as themselves as European. In fact, there has been a recent campaign where the students of UK universities are petitioning to be included in the Erasmus program. So I believe most of the students of UK universities still recognize as themselves as European students, and they believe in the European values. So this clearly defining what an utopian student would present in the future of this Confederation of Utopia is very important, and this needs to be included in the governance charter, I would say. And there needs to be like, I'm not sure if it's the right term to say, but there needs to be a philosophical awakening in the minds of students to be able to connect better to the identity of the alliance, what alliance means to them. And the question is not why to do this, but how to do this. Like, how do we create a common utopian student identity? And there is a need for more participatory and decentralized decision-making process, which would make this student involvement more peculiar and make the decision-making process stronger, because universities exist if all the stakeholders are involved equally in all the decision-making processes. So another concern for student participation in university governance is that, as it was already discussed at some point in the discussion, that students these days are more career directed, and rather than participating in the process of decision making in university administration, they are more focused on how to get jobs, how to get promotions and things like that. So students are relatively disinterested in student activities both on campus and as well as disinterested in being part of the decision-making process. So as I mentioned, what would solve this problem would be the presentation of a common utopian identity and the presentation of a strong Utopia Student Council. And for this to happen, I have a proposal, to reform the student council structure. And what I call this model is a distributed leadership model. And how I or we as a team have imagined this is that right now, the Utopia Student Council has one representative, at least one representative from each university. We can keep that existing structure of the current Utopia Student Council and call it the board of the Utopia Student Council. And then we propose to create a separate working group, the working group of students under the umbrella of the Student Council itself. And the members of these working groups would be part of each Utopia work package, because work package, I think, is the basis of the working of the alliance as a whole. As of now, if you take any work package and you look at the number of students involved in those work package, or the members of those work package is, let's say if there are 20 members in the work package, there are like 2 students or 3 students, I would say. So calling ourselves a student-centric alliance and having 10% participation in work packages is what we believe as a team is not acceptable. It should be increased. Student participation in the work packages should be increased. And what happens is when you have less students in this work package meetings or as members of this work package committees, is that students are there as a minority. And when students are there in minority in such committees, it becomes very difficult for them to influence the decisions. So essentially, everything that is decided upon are project managers, by professors, by deans, or people who are very high up the ladder in the Utopia functioning. So this needs to be reformed, I would say, with all due respect. And we propose that having work packages expansion by having two additional student representatives in each work package. So these additional students would ideally be a biannual mandate, like each starting with a 1-year difference, so that one student can train the other coming student. And what would happen is that this proposed expansion of the student council by creating this working group would ensure that greater student input goes into the work package work and into work package decision making. And it would also make the student council more relevant in the context of Utopia, and this would bring in more student participation, and it would lead to the overall development of the work package system and involve more students. So this would be a kind of like parallel Utopia, like parallel work package system working at the student level and overall the working group system can also have one Utopia project manager as a mentor to provide guidance whenever required. So this is one proposition, to create a working group under the umbrella of the Utopia Student Council. And an additional proposition to, like, I'm going into a bit more detail, but an additional proposition to this proposal would be that these representatives of the working group, which would be part of the work packages, should also hold some representation in the local university student bodies. That would mean, let's say, work package 1 is led by University of Warwick. It would be very helpful to have a student representative from Warwick in the working group, in the work package 1, and in the Warwick Student Union. So that would mean it would create a connection between the local student body, between the work package, and between the student council. All these three things would be linked by these members of this working group. So that's one proposition from our side to improve to improve the cooperation between alliances as well, because everything would be linked if we successfully manage to create such a working group. And it would also make the Utopia Student Council more relevant, which would in turn make them realize that it's important to address some issues and to give voice to the students. Another point which I want to discuss is regarding creating a feedback mechanism. Feedback mechanism is like these days, universities tend to emphasize more on student satisfaction and developing mechanism to support and give regard to education. But at the same time, universities sometimes disregard student involvement in the decision-making process. So there is a need to create a feedback mechanism which would become a primary venue for the students to give their opinion, how they want to be involved in the governance structure. Unfortunately for this, we don't really have any ideas of what kind of global pan-Utopia feedback mechanism we can have so that all the students can give their ideas to be involved in the governance processes. And yes, yeah, another small yet very relevant suggestion to develop, I don't think it is really directly linked to our two principles. Maybe it is, but it is more linked to creating the identity of Utopia and to having more student participation, is by creating physical spaces in the partner universities. When students see a space dedicated to student engagement in their partner university and Utopia space, they would, we believe there would be definitely more participation, more discussion, more debate on having on various principles and on the working of Utopia and student council and all these things. So there should be some, everything right now is digital. Like there should be somewhere in some university an Utopia Student Council office, physical space, where students can go in, give suggestions, and some sort of physical space to allow students to be more included. Also, there are a few more points which I would just like to mention. which I think have already been mentioned by a few of you, but universities should appoint students from different ages and different academic backgrounds when they are getting the student involved in different work packages or in different roles. The student body of universities change very fast. So it would be easier to have students who are in the earlier year of their studies, and so that the students get familiarized with the EUTOPIA working structure in a year or so, and they stay with the EUTOPIA Alliance to contribute to the Alliance for the next 1 or 2 years. So this is just one idea. And then again, there is one, like if we want to look better and if we want to improve student participation, we need to improve the cooperation between alliances. We need to ensure gender neutral participation. This point is not very is very relevant to these two principles, but to all of the principles that were discussed, to ensure women participation, to ensure non-binary participation in all the student activities. And this is one thing that I believe the EUTOPIA Student Council should address and take into account. Also, I believe once the EUTOPIA Student Council becomes more relevant and it has more autonomy to take decisions or to create initiatives related to the student activities or student events, these decisions should be quickly addressed by the EUTOPIA structure. There needs to be some mechanism which quickly approves decisions taken by the EUTOPIA Student Council, which would allow or improve the autonomous or structure of the Student Council and make it more quick in terms of decision making. So in the end, I would like to conclude by making a point that university governance and student governance are two different matters. University governance is like making decisions in the working of university. Student governance is like making decisions about student activities or how students are involved, or these two are really very interlinked, and these two aspects, although very different, need to be addressed together, the university governance and student governance. And in conclusion, a change in the current structure can be brought about in two ways: by creating a common utopian student identity to make use of the better use of the existing student structures, existing EUTOPIA student structures. And the second is by reforming the existing student representation structure by some of the ways which we proposed to make student participation more relevant, to make EUTOPIA Student Council more relevant, which would in turn lead to more academic autonomy and more cooperation in terms of student participation between the alliances. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this presentation.